Recording. Okay, great, perfect. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the March 2022, our first event of 2022, monthly webinar on development and photography ethics. So unfortunately, my colleague who I normally run this with, Elise Chota, she's on maternity leave. Unfortunately for me, great for her. She's just had a really nice, beautiful little girl called Maya. So yeah, this is our first one of the year. And unfortunately, our events are a bit more sporadic at the moment, as you may have noticed, but we'll be having them from time to time. So today, our webinar is on ethical development fieldwork in the post-pandemic world. And it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Professor Regina Scheyvens and Dr. Api Movono, who are joining us from New Zealand and Fiji, respectively. So hi Regina, how are you doing today?
Hi, kia ora, doing very well, thanks.
Great, and how are you, Api?
Nisambulunaka, doing very well, enjoying the humidity here in Suva.
Oh, wonderful. That's great. That's great. It's such a pleasure to have you. And thank you so much for joining, even though I know it's really late there. It's 9 p.m. or 8 p.m.
Oh, it's a real pleasure. No, thanks, Catherine. We're excited to be talking with everyone today about a topic that's close to our hearts and something we've been really involved in for the last couple of years.
Oh, great. Fantastic. That's fantastic. So I'll just introduce our speakers quickly before we dive into the topic. So Api is a senior lecturer from Massey University, where he researches and promotes development that is fair, resilient, and sustainable for future generations. He's an active conservationist and a community development advocate in Fiji and the Pacific region more widely. And Regina is a professor of development studies, also at Massey University, where she teaches and conducts research on tourism and sustainable development. And she's written numerous books and innumerable research articles. And through her work, she continues to reflect on ethical fieldwork in terms of both her own research in the South Pacific and also through her supervision of postgraduate students. So we've really got two development fieldwork experts in the room today. So yeah, do feel free to type your questions in the chat and we will get to those. And yeah, I think we're quite a small group actually today. So what might be quite nice is that when we do get to the Q&A at the end, that we can perhaps have people turn on their cameras and engage in a more kind of dynamic way in the conversation. Great. So I'm going to start off by just asking you both if you can tell the audience a little bit about your experiences of doing development fieldwork, and in particular, what's led you to your interest in promoting more ethical practices.
Oh, thanks, Catherine. Well, I'm the oldest of the two, and so with the longest history doing this, but I started doing PhD research at quite an interesting time, actually. I had done a BA honours in human geography and social anthropology, and then wanted to do a PhD in development studies because I was really interested in interdisciplinarity and being able to draw on a range of different disciplinary fields to investigate particular issues that I wanted to explore. And so it was the early 90s and I was getting into my PhD, and everything I was reading was questioning what had been the presumed right of the researcher to go off to the field and collect data. And so in the 80s, there were some really important works that came out that seriously criticised extractive types of research and that argued that if there was to be a place for palangis, as I'd be called in the Pacific, to be doing research, then we better engage in some very careful reflection about power relations, about our positionality, about the roles we could play, and think very carefully about reciprocity, about how we could give back through fieldwork experience and through the research we were doing. So that was very much front and center for me, things to think about during my PhD. And then afterwards, got involved in teaching human geography and then development studies. And I was doing lots of supervision of masters and PhD students who were grappling with similar issues. And it was interesting to find that many of my students from what we'd now call global South countries had similar struggles and issues too, because they also faced some different power relations depending on whether they were already seen as somewhat elite in their society, or if they were certainly seen as privileged for the opportunity to study overseas, and the way where they were seen by others when going back based on their gender and a whole bunch of other factors as well. So that led us, a bunch of us, to get involved in this book on development fieldwork. And researching this was super interesting, and learned a lot from the different scholars collaborated with on that one. And I also wanted to say that while you introduced us as knowing quite a bit about this topic, we do know a bit, but we think we've still got a bit to learn as well. So looking forward to the discussion, the Q&A with everyone who's tuned in today or tonight, depending on what part of the world that you're in. And thanks everyone for coming along. Looking forward to the discussion. Api.
Yeah, thank you, Regina, and thanks, Catherine, for having us. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be able to share our experiences and, you know, to share a little about our experiences doing development fieldwork. For me, what led me to engage in development fieldwork was my curiosity into how indigenous communities of the South Pacific, and more specifically, indigenous Fijian communities, are impacted by tourism. So I did my first master's research in 2009, and this was a time when you know, tourism impacts was a very popular topic of study in the area. But there were very few studies actually being done by indigenous peoples, and far fewer indigenous peoples of the South Pacific doing research in this area. So I set out to do firstly, you know, a mixed method approach. I did quantitative and qualitative methods, and then I did it in 2 indigenous communities in one of the major tourism hubs in Fiji, the Coral Coast. I learned a lot, but I was very fresh, and I stuck to the textbooks and to the guidelines that were very prescriptive and directive in what we needed to do. However, you know, after I finished my master's, I realized that there was more I could contribute in this area, particularly with my background as an indigenous Fijian, understanding the culture, the protocols, the aesthetics, and the intangibles. So this is what sort of spurred my interest in doing a PhD, where I went back to the same community, and I thought I'd practice a few I don't know whether it qualifies as an ethical principle, but in the eyes of Fijians, flying in and flying out, and you know, coming in for a short visit, that's what tourists do. But for people who are working in development or engaged in developing a community, needs to take a longer term, a genuine approach where we actually engage. So I did an ethnographic study where I lived in this community, the same community. You know, started my engagement in 2019, went back in 2015, finished my fieldwork in the middle of 2016. So I spent roughly 8 months there. And here was where I really cut my teeth in trying to merge the 2 worlds and bring about better ways of doing more ethical practices from the perception and views of locals or indigenous peoples of the South Pacific. So yeah, in a nutshell, I guess I'm still quite fresh, still learning, but very, I feel it's very important that we understand where it is that we are conducting these fieldworks, and the ethical practices that should accompany, these communities and peoples. So yeah, that's.
Yeah. There's already so much to get into. I think it's really interesting when talking about trying to move away from extractive field work and really putting indigenous knowledge and voices at the center. Looking at the different methods that you use, quantitative and qualitative, and the different ethics around using different methods, and talking about going out as a very early career naive field worker and making all those mistakes and following the rule book and then finding out the rule book needs to be thrown out the window. So yeah, really interesting. So yeah, Api, you've done a lot of work recently on the impact of COVID-19 in the Pacific Islands. And I was wondering if you can tell us through your work, what do you think are the biggest changes that you've seen in these ethical questions surrounding development field work from before the pandemic to now?
Yeah, I think, before the pandemic, there was almost, how do I describe this? People feel that there's a right for us to go out and conduct research and to be out in the field, to gain access into these communities. But what the pandemic has done, it's flipped that upside down, and it presents a number of challenges particularly for social scientists like us and like ourselves who want to engage with people. So in terms of the changes that we've seen, well, that disconnect between you and your field site. How can we do ethical research remotely? This is the question, whether we want to go as far as to involve local communities as part of the data collection process, or to empower them to be part of the, to own, collectively own the research. But I think, more in more general terms, the pandemic has also reminded us of the human element to research. And what I'm seeing is that more and more people now are more concerned about the the ethics of doing field work and dealing with people. There's a larger voice now of people who are coming out and realizing that the ethics process is merely to protect the university, and not really, there's no real focus there to protect people and their data. But I'll go across to Regina now. I think she has a few points to add on as well.
Oh, thanks, Api. I guess, yeah, that key thing is we had to think very carefully about how can we do ethical research remotely? How can we do any research, asking the questions that Api and I have been most concerned about right from the start of the pandemic. And for those of you from the Northern Hemisphere who are not so familiar with the COVID context down here, essentially New Zealand's international borders have been closed for 2 years. Api was able to travel home to Fiji only very recently. And it's the same for most Pacific countries. Cook Islands and Fiji both had times of opening up and shutting down and then opening up again to tourism. But there has not been free movement. It's been one of the most closed up parts of the world. So we were really worried as soon as the pandemic struck about the financial implications for lots of people in the Pacific, lots of these communities we knew who were involved in tourism, who got their incomes from tourism. You might have 3 people in a family of 10 that are working at a resort. And the resorts had to close their doors, most of them pretty quickly. and there were no wage subsidies in most of the countries we were studying. They just couldn't afford them, okay? And so that makes it really tough. So we wanted to be able to find out what was going on for those people. We were concerned about them, but we were also very aware of the fact that there were cultural institutions and systems that could support them, provide a bit of a safety net at these times. And they indeed did kick in lots of ways: customary land, traditional knowledge, the ways that families and clans came out to support each other, and their spirituality was really important. But how did we find that out? Well, we needed to do some research to discover that. Well, we basically two main ways. One way was we've done a couple of surveys. The first of them was an online survey distributed via social media, but that was a bit haphazard in terms of who it got to. So then we did a researcher administered survey, and we did interviews. We've done 2 lots of main interviews, and that researcher administered survey that have relied on us recruiting RAs, who we call research associates rather than research assistants. And we've recruited them in country, and they're people in each of the 5 countries where we've done data collection on the ground. They're people who either have a connection to the tourism industry or have research experience, or preferably a bit of both. But we really there wasn't like a huge pool of people that we could draw upon, but based on existing relationships, particularly relationships that Api had in different field sites, and he was a lecturer at University of the South Pacific prior to coming to Massey, so he'd taught students from all around the Pacific who were back in their home countries. We basically recruited these RAs to come on board, and we ran sessions over Zoom to ensure that they were comfortable with the research process, with the methodology and the ethics of the research. And then we checked in with them regularly during the data collection process. And then they had a say with the report writing that was done at the end of the 2 major phases of research we've done as well. So it's really those RAs that have enabled the research to happen in that way. And I will say, while we've got Fung, one of our PhD students, tuned in here for this session today, I hope she'll be able to share with everyone in the Q&A a somewhat similar process she's done for data collection in Vietnam when she couldn't travel there herself. But she actually focused even more on working to empower her research assistants, that 3 of them that she had in a remote part of Vietnam. So it'd be good for people to hear from her later, I think, as well.
Oh, great, thanks. It's really interesting to hear about your experience of doing sort of shifting towards remote data collection management practices. I guess just as sort of a follow-up question, there's a lot of benefits I think I've found, because I've been doing some of that myself in Ethiopia, and I've found that it can be a really, really good way of doing it. It provides employment for people in the country. It can offer capacity building in skills development for researchers in country. It avoids flying, so it avoids the carbon emissions from that. I think it can really help to strengthen those existing relationships with in-country researchers as well. But then on the flip side, I was wondering if you encountered, what challenges you encountered doing the work that way, if you see if there's sort of, what is the space for doing that better, I suppose.
Sure. Api, do you want to go first on that?
Yeah, in terms of challenges, right? I think it's the difference in time zones, and when I say this, not just the fact that we live in different time zones, but that people's appreciation and how they value and use time is also different. And I had to relearn this when I returned to Fiji. Was frustrated at first to see that things don't happen instantly in the developing world, and that there are many challenges that people will face, whether it's technological issues, whether it's friends and family, where there's an emergency or there's a truck overturns in the one main major highway that'll delay the arrival of somebody to come in. So there are, you have all these challenges that people face on the ground. And then you have challenges to do with the distance that we have, not being able to meet, meeting online. You may encounter people providing you with not just not excuses really, but reasons for why things cannot happen on time or promptly as we would expect. And I guess, these two main challenges are the ones that I would like to share. Is something that I've come to appreciate a lot when I'm here in country and trying to organize this research that I'm doing, flying out to the islands. Planes get cancelled on 20 minutes after you arrive at the airport, and things like that will happen. And yeah, it's just something that we need to adapt to. And I think part of our ethical consideration of doing research in different areas must also include the environment in which people operate. In the developing world, there are many challenges. Water cuts, electricity, blackouts are just a few to name that we often take for granted when we live in the more developed parts of the world. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, well said, Api. And also, if someone decides to do some digging and digs through the main power cable for the whole community, or you no longer have internet access for the next 24 hours because of something like that. These things happen to Api as well when he's supposed to be teaching or from Fiji or presenting seminars and so forth. So yeah, these are realities, and I just think it's a lot to do with the cross-cultural research environment anyway. Like Api says, accepting things as reasons rather than excuses, because I think there's a real Western tendency to think, okay, so there's a funeral in the village. Okay, does it have to take a whole week to, is that going to delay the research? In fact, the very things that Api and I have found that have provided a really strong support system for people during the shock of the pandemic, and have absolutely helped them to cope and have enhanced some people's well-being during a very difficult time. They're the very same things, which also mean that you can't get this report delivered at this time, or we want to work more closely with our research associates. We want them to be involved in the analysis of the data, but they don't really have the time to do that. And we want to, we think our ideal might be to empower them to co-write the final draft of the report, but they don't actually want that. They don't have the time to do that. They want us to write that and to give them enough time to look through it and to see if it then accords with them, so they feel happy having their name on the cover as well. That's the type of thing. So it's being aware of those things, and our ideals in some way might not align that well with some realities for some of those that we're doing the research with. And so that's been just we've had that constant reminder of that. It's nice to hear from Api that even he needed a reminder after only living in New Zealand for a couple of years and having lived in Australia as well for a little while, Api?
Yeah, and just to add one last point to that question, it's our ethical responsibility as researchers to understand the realities where our research is taking place, our fieldwork is taking place, and it's often more complex and more than what the eye can see. And going forward, we have to be sympathetic towards people who live in these surrounds, who conduct research here in the field. I think that's a key point to remember.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much. There's so much to get into. I have so many questions, but I'm aware of time, so I'm going to move on to the next our next topic, which is about intersectional identities. So yeah, this where to start with this? There are specific ethical challenges that field workers experience because of their intersectional identities, such as racism or discrimination based on sexuality, or I faced quite a lot of gender-based harassment through my field work. And I was wondering if you would be able to comment on to what extent do you think that intersectional identities are considered in development fieldwork ethics, in terms of the theory, the training that field workers receive, looking at how it's sort of mainstreamed in ethics review processes, health and safety processes, and different types of support. Maybe. Yeah.
That's a great question, Catherine. Really, really interesting. And to be honest, I had a conversation with the person, my colleague, Rochelle Stewart-Withers, who coordinates our development research design postgrad course. And we were reflecting on this together. And she said to me, look, it's actually, we don't use the term intersectionality and the theory of it when we're doing our work with our students at the moment, but we probably should. And definitely, if there's ever a new edition, a third edition of the development fieldwork book, I think it's very important to have that discussion in there. But what Rochelle reminded me we have always done is asked students to reflect very carefully on their positionality. So that's coming back to something I raised earlier, regardless of who they are, which country. It's not just about what country you're from, as you've noted. There's all these issues of class or caste sometimes. There's issues of sexuality. There's issues of gender. There's quite a lot that comes into the mix. And going, thinking about the students I've supervised myself and seeing the various positions that they occupy and how they intersect. It's very interesting how that can impact on them. I remember a student from the Solomon Islands, Gloria, who, when she was at home doing research, she should have been considered someone with some status. She'd come overseas on an international scholarship. She had previously been working in the government. She was treated so poorly in government offices when she tried to get appointments when she wanted to just meet people or set up interviews, in contexts where maybe myself as a woman could have waltzed in, maybe, or maybe not. I know other parts of the Pacific where that wouldn't have been the case, and where people from that country would have been treated better than foreign researchers. I think Samoa is an example of that. But I think it's different for everybody. When I went back and had a look through the development fieldwork book, I was reminded of some examples of researchers who I didn't know about when I was citing them in the book, but it's since worked with them a little bit, like Farhana Sultana is one who, through the AAG, I ended up being in the development geography specialist group with her. And we had cited her in the development fieldwork book, talking about reflecting on her positionality. She said, I was also othered by those who were observing and studying me in the field. And this is her going back to Bangladesh to do research. This was perhaps particularly true of the men I interviewed, especially in educated and policy circles. The reverse power relations were obvious in the many rejections of meetings, disregarding appointments granted, guarded responses and rushed interviews, and the condescending attitudes towards me and my work. So the short answer to your question is, at the moment at Massey University, we don't specifically talk about intersectionality when we think of these issues, but we do talk about positionality. And your question has provoked us to think that we will bring a deeper discussion of intersectionality into the work in the future.
Yeah, interesting. I think it's a gap across lots of different institutions. I think in Oxford, we don't really talk about it either. Yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't sort of put that connection so clearly between intersectional identities and positionality, but it's definitely, it's sort of a different term for sort of talking about the same kind of thing. So I suppose that there is that sort of theoretical basis for thinking about it in fieldwork, which is interesting. And what about you, Api?
Yeah, well, we were trained in ensuring that you know your positionality as a researcher. And I like to think in the context of research in the South Pacific, research of positionality is very important for researchers to understand where they are within the field. And for me, as an indigenous Fijian researcher, I also am aware of my positionality, not just because I'm indigenous Fijian, but because I'm from a certain part of Fiji and I'm affiliated with a certain tribe. I'm married. I was married before I went into the field. And all of those positions or hats that you hold have implications when you mingle and when you interact with people at the community level. So it's important to know where all these things intersect and how you can pivot and navigate your way within the different levels of the communities or areas where you want to conduct your research, particularly in the Pacific. I think when I first read your question, I thought about what an elder from my research community once told me when I departed after I finished my master's study. And he said, "Hey, please, you have to remember our village. Don't forget us when you've gotten your certificate. You have to come back because we are involved, we are connected now." And that gave me an insight, and it reminded me of our responsibility as researchers, not to be extractive, not to just fly in and fly out, but we need to, because we're dealing with human beings, we're establishing these human connections. And of course, knowing your position, whether you are a Fijian of Indian descent, or you are a Pacific Islander from Vanuatu, there are differences and complexities when you conduct research in the field. And knowing your position as a researcher, positionality, will help you along when you're actually in the field. So that's, a few tips for those wanting to come and do research in the South Pacific.
Interesting, that's great, thanks. It sounds like we've got some people in the audience who've been working in the Pacific context, which is exciting. Great, yeah, it's a really interesting discussion. So I want to move on now to talk a little bit about ethics review processes. So I don't know, it'd be really interesting to hear about your experience, but my experience of it is that there is a very strong, heavy reliance on ethics review processes as the entry point for students and early career researchers to engage with ethical issues in development. And it's very much sort of like a tick box exercise, sort of going through a process to make sure, as you mentioned, that the university has legally got their backs covered in research that does data collection with human participants. But as we know, even going into communities as an outsider, even as a physical scientist, where you're not necessarily directly interviewing or collecting data with human participants, can also have ethical implications. And so there are quite a few sort of limitations of the ethics review process. And I was wondering, what do you see from your experience as the key limitations, and how do you think that this has changed now since the pandemic?
Well, Catherine, I think it's a really good question again, and it's a little bit sad almost to hear that it's just as bad as when we first wrote the first edition of Development Fieldwork, which was back in 2003. And basically, we were commenting there in the ethics chapter that most university ethics processes were often a top-down type of legalistic sort of process in some ways, risk averse from the university's perspective. But what we tried to argue for in the ethics chapter was that we should be thinking more about a bottom-up type of ethics as development researchers, so that we're not just trying to do no harm through our research, but actually in some way trying to do good without trying to be a do-gooder white savior Barbie type in the mix. And so it's almost like what Api said just before, what this leader, this elder had said to him. It's about the relationships you develop in the field. And even if you get, it's not even, like you say, they're often tick box exercises. And to be honest, Massey's process has improved quite a bit over the years. And we have a low risk notification system now, which is based around if there is a system within your own program or department, and we have an in-house ethics process and development studies that's more collegial and discussion based, probing some of the issues and understanding the different cross-cultural research students might be intending to do. If you go through a process like that, then it's you don't have to engage in the full university process. And I think actually we have a very robust system in place, which is quite fair. But you could go through our process and you could go and apply to the government of the country in the Pacific where you'd want to do the research, pay your research fee, fill out various sheets of paper. But it's still going to come down to where are you actually, who are you doing your research with? If it's with any sort of community and wherever it is, whether it's in an urban or rural area, are they getting a say over you being there or not? And collecting and hanging out with them. Know that everyone we go to do research does matter on this question, and of us who've done different ways. Sorry, is my connection okay, or did it cut out?
Yeah, it did cut out.
I'm really sorry. Did my connection cut out for a moment? And I'm really sorry. I know why that is. Whenever the microwave oven runs in our household, it interrupts Zoom. And my son just came back. Is it okay now?
Yeah, it seems to be fine now. Yeah.
Really sorry about that. Gosh, where did you lose me? At what point?
It was probably about halfway through, I think. Oh no, just a few sentences back. Yeah.
I don't know what I was saying. Api, can you help me out? This is when we find out how good of friends we really are.
Yeah, I think you explained that now we have a robust system in place in Massey, and I think before you cut off, I wanted to sort of just add to that. Yes, box ticking exercise. I think at Griffith University, it was a very long process. And I think the Massey University one is far shorter, but it was all to ensure that we protected the university and the brand, whilst also, doing the right thing in the eyes of the university. It was not until, you're out in the field that you realize that there's heaps of other things that you need to adhere to be ethical in your approach. So I guess we have to do right by the university. That's why we have those box ticking exercises. But we also have to do right and do good by the communities within our field sites. There has to be a reciprocal relationship where they benefit, where they receive some form of empowerment. They become empowered by the knowledge that they give. After all, this is not our knowledge, it's their knowledge, which from their goodwill, they're able to share with us. But you see, the ethics form at Griffith didn't say that, you have to go and do this protocol, say was able to get in, you have to act in a certain way, you have to build a rapport. And often Palangi researchers and some who come from the global south, some people I've met, come in with that disconnect. of the realities on the ground. And while they have all the best intentions, there's still that disconnect between what is ethical and proper and right from the eyes of the locals and communities where you're going to do research. I think that's what I wanted to add in, and so sort of to close the loop here. I think that's what we need to work towards in our universities, to ensure that there's a more robust system in place that protects those whom we are going to do research on, or we're going to carry out research. And just before we jump to the next question, I shared with Regina early on how shocked I was. I interviewed a climate change advocate in the past 2 weeks, and I had this term pop up twice or three times, the harvesting of people's opinions. And I was just shocked because it sounds so extractive. It is, so extractive. You go in and you harvest. Did you plant these things that you're going to harvest? No, that's stealing, in other words. But here's the thing. This is part of the climate change adaptation language that's being used at these high-level meetings. So we have to do right by those universities, but we have to do right by those communities where we conduct our research. Thank you, Catherine.
And just to quickly compare that with the approach that our colleague, Dr. Litea Meon-Simwabu, took when she did research back in her mother's home area of Fiji. She did her PhD through Massey as well, but when she went home, it was really important for her mother's people to put in place what she ended up calling a cultural discernment group, which is essentially a group of her extended family or aunties who told her how she should go about the research. Now, that was nothing that the ethics process at Massey would have been aware of. They wouldn't have required her to be sensitive to anything like that. But if you're looking at ethics from the ground up, she did right by them. That was the appropriate way for her to engage and behave, and handing over quite a bit of control, in fact, to that group of aunties. So, it's really, that's quite different from those climate change researchers Api's just been interacting with, harvesting data.
Gosh, yeah. That makes me so uncomfortable. Okay, so we'll just dive into the final question really quickly, and so we can get onto the Q&A. But so to someone in the audience who was about to do some development field work, maybe for the first time, what 3 pieces of advice would you give them to guide them towards best ethical practice?
Okay, fantastic. I thought this was going to be a hard question, but to me, it's quite straightforward. Be humble. So don't assume you have the right to do this. If you're thinking you'd like to do some research, realize it's a real privilege to be able to go to someone else's place. Doesn't matter whether it's in your own country and it's another community, or whether it's overseas. Be humble. Prepare well. The right way to respect your research participants is to understand about them. And that means preparing in terms of some language, understand their history of colonialism, if that's important, the current political context, economic challenges, the whole spectrum. So you prepare really well to have a deep appreciation of the research that's already conducted and the context in which you'll be doing your research. That means you're not going to be wasting people's time when you're in the field if you have done that good preparation. So be humble, prepare well. And my final one is combine that genuine intellectual curiosity that you should have with respect. So be really respectful. What we often talk about in relation to respecting Māori society and culture here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is to think about doing things in what we'd call a mana enhancing way. Enhance the mana, the dignity of the people you are doing the research with. That is a key thing. So be humble, prepare well, be respectful. Api?
Yeah, I almost don't know what to say, but I also have three things to sort of share to add on to Regina's point. We have to be patient when we're out in the field. Things won't always go our way, particularly if you're doing research in the South Pacific. The time zones are different, and so too are the times when you expect boats to arrive, boats to leave, buses, etc. These things will happen. Breakdown in communication. So patience is very important because you can easily lose your mind, and you can go off on people, on the closest person beside you. With that said, we also have to be adaptive, be ready to switch up and change plans on the fly and adapt to whatever situation that you're presented with. At one stage, I was expecting to do interviews with women's group on a certain day of the week because I had other plans, but then there was a funeral in the village, so no data collection for 2 weeks. What did we do instead? Well, change your plans, switch it up, adapt. And lastly, because we're dealing with humans, particularly if we're social science researchers, build those relationships and build genuine relationships. We're very fortunate that we've built up good relationships with people across the Pacific who have, who have reciprocated our goodwill, and just being good mates and good friends. It always comes back. It's useful when you're wanting to do extended research over extended periods of time. And it's a virtue that a lot of people in the Pacific respect, when you can build this relationship with them, make friends, not enemies, right? Yeah, those three things: being patient, be ready to adapt, and forge those genuine relationships while you're out in the field.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much. Great advice. Okay, great. So I'm going to go over to the audience now, and I've just changed the settings so everybody can unmute themselves or turn their video on. So if anybody has any questions for Regina and Api, please do feel free to jump in. Oh, hi Shane, great to see you.
It looks like there's one in the chat as well.
Oh, yeah.
From Neely?
Can I start by saying thank you for a really wonderful and useful session. My name's Scheyvens and I work for the Royal Geographical Society, and I'm the Expeditions and Fieldwork Advisor. And your top tips were absolutely on the nail, and I'm sure I'll be writing to follow up. But I'd be interested in my role in providing training. One of the great things that I think has happened thanks to the pandemic is to be giving more Indigenous voices. So Api, it was really lovely to hear your perception and even your top tips compared to Regina's were, were very contrasting, but different lenses. So maybe a question, if no one else has got one more important, is how you think we can best prepare students who are passionate about development to move from being do-gooders to trying to help create a better world.
That's for you, Api.
Maybe to help you, Api, because I think there's a danger that, because I'm absolutely with you on the ethics, and as Catherine knows, the RGS is trying to do a lot of work in this area despite our very complicated history. I think there's a danger that you can, the fear of getting it wrong can move you into inaction. And we all need to be in this together.
Yes. Thanks. Thank you so much for your question. How do we get students from being do-gooders to actually doing good in the world? I think, this is where it's important to have a strong supervisory team. But I think one thing that COVID has done is that it's made the world much smaller. meaning that people like us can converge and meet online at any time of our choosing. So if we have a student that requires expertise in, say, who's doing development field work in Africa, it's easy for us now to reach out to those experts who can then inform us. And I think I understand that fear of getting it wrong in a context that you're not familiar with. And that's why we have, these supervisory structures and additional support from the broader network of academics and friends in the field. I think that's one way we can do it. The other way is to ensure that the materials we provide our students, the expectations, and the training is enough to get them on that plane and to venture out into the field wherever it is. And we'll expect them to cut their teeth in the field and experience for themselves. And either way, their reflections, their critical reflections on whether they got it wrong, whether they got it right, their feelings as a result of engaging in the process. I think this all builds into this pool of knowledge that we're all creating worldwide for better ethical approaches to development fieldwork. In a nutshell, I think, I don't know if that made any sense. I think that's the way forward.
Api, I think the most important thing you said at the end is also the review process, because I think the first two I don't disagree with, but I just think that the review and reflection phase can very easily get lost, even if you're part of a formal degree process. And I work with a lot of informal researchers, and particularly young researchers who might have come up with their own project and find it harder to do co-creation and collaboration.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think the review process of learning by doing, they're obviously, taking Regina's point about being as prepared as you can. But thank you, that was a really thoughtful and helpful reply.
Thanks, Shane. We're very short on time, and I just want to give voice to some others in the room. So I'm going to go over to Johanna first, and then to Bridget, and then to Glenda for questions and comments. And then I'm going to come back to Regina and Api to respond.
Actually, my question's been answered, so I don't have anything else to ask just now.
Okay, great, thanks. Bridget. You're on mute.
Hi. Look, I just wanted to maybe look at just pick up on the points you made around data, and especially during COVID, and about the privacy of that data that you've gotten, especially across time zones and into different country settings, which might have very different kind of privacy rules around kind of the data and actually the communications that you might have had during the pandemic, and whether you've kind of looked at that or how that's managed.
It's a really interesting question, but I'm not sure though that that it relates Api to the countries where we collected data. We didn't. What do you think? Do you think that?
In terms of privacy and maintaining the confidentiality of our respondents, we were able to toe the line with regards to our ethics. But look, I'll tell you something else. A couple of people that we interviewed and that spoke to our RAs actually wanted to be named and to be mentioned. And so for us, it was considering whether to include it or, and give power to them in that way. But in terms of privacy of data, we did all the usual stuff to make sure that it was recorded, that it was not shared, that we maintained the integrity of the data, and we were very particular about what went out into the various outputs that we did, whether it was a conversation article or some other publication. Yeah.
Yeah, I just one other thing I was thinking, Api, we did, because we used a survey, which, Bridget, we hadn't always done surveys before. Survey had a quantitative and a qualitative component, but the surveys, the great thing about them was that we really didn't know who was filling those in, apart from the bit of demographic data that they provided. And that was whether it went out via social media or was researcher administered, which was our second survey. That's how it was delivered. But also for the other data that came in from the interviews, which, by the way, using research associates was amazing. We got incredibly rich qualitative data. It was awesome because they had relationships with a lot of people in the field sites. You know, it, like for some researchers, they might feel quite nervous about not being there themselves, asking the questions and gathering the data. But might have been fine with Api, but take me out of the equation and, there's all sorts of great things that are shared. Fantastic. No, it's great. But we use descriptors, and on the consent form, which they don't have to, they can give oral consent, but they can state how they would like to be described in the research. So they can say, well, could you just describe me as a boat operator from Vanuatu, or as a tour guide from Fiji, or whatever it is. So we kind of think, well, that's quite good if it's a way that the reader can still get some information, but without giving away the full identity of the person.
Right. Okay. Good. It was also kind of looking at, just in terms of RP, what you mentioned around, around the harvesting of data and the use of that terminology. Obviously you look at the all these kind of social media companies or whatever, or basically are extracting data, etc. But it's also been like in terms of this kind of, in terms of using it in terms of climate, whether this is just very much around, it's a whole thing of measuring social capital or network capital, or like all these kind of like multi-capitals. So which is very kind of quite extractive as well, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we do have time to go over to Glenda if you wanted to ask your question.
Kia ora, team.
I wanted to ask
you, Hi. I wanted to ask you, while you're here, both of you, which is fabulous. I'm very privileged. I'm working on 2 research projects at the moment, and I'm still doing my undergrad, so I'm very spoiled. But one of them is is about racism and whitening of green space, basically. And there's multiple co-authors. Some are in New Zealand. And then there are 2 Indigenous or Aboriginal researchers, co-authors we're all in different parts or different country. And there are different dynamics of power. And I am finding that really interesting and challenging. So the power within the difference of the various peoples on different countries, but also the power between myself and my supervisor, if you like, who's also a co-author in New Zealand. That relationship is really challenging for me. It's not being made challenging by anyone other than me, I'm sure, but just trying to find a way to keep momentum going. With what you talked about, Api, was very useful. The trusting time, space, changing across culture, totally fine with that. I'm good with waiting 8, 9, 10 weeks now for a line. That's okay. But that's okay. But the power around who has the say over what goes where and so on, that's kind of being left with me at the moment to manage, and I have no idea what I'm doing. Have you got any tips?
You want me to jump in, Regina? Well, I think you're in a very special learning environment to be able to discern those different power relationships. But I guess if it's with you to manage, it means that your leadership traits are being acknowledged within the group and the cohort. And usually, if you're leading that paper, then please, by all means, exercise the power that has been given unto you. But here's the thing, these different power relations, they exist. And we need to acknowledge that these power relationships, and as an individual, as a person who works in a space with different power dynamics and different personality traits, this is where you continue your social scientist training in managing these situations and navigating your way around these different power structures to be able to create those outputs. That's just from me, from my personal experience, and just a tip to you. With great power comes great responsibility. If it's on your desk, please write it up.
Yeah, and the fact that you are kind of a little bit torn and troubled by this is a very good sign that you are aware, and that self-awareness is very helpful for anyone doing research, especially in the social sciences. Yeah, I think that's
absolutely
great.
Thank you.
So are you going to the question in the chat from Fenji? Yeah,
from
that would be
Fenji,
great. Yeah,
and Fenji, you could put your camera on. Fenji's coming to us from China, where she's been in lockdown for way too long. But Fenji, one little thing I'll say in relation to your question about was anyone unwilling to cooperate? Well, because Api and I weren't approaching them directly ourselves, we weren't seeing that. Our RAs would have been seeing that, but they didn't report much in that direction. But one thing I'll say is that we took a real strengths-based approach to our research. We were looking for positives. We were not taking a deficit approach. So we were trying to ask people about what were some of their adaptive strategies, and what were some of the alternative ways they were finding of earning an income, or how had they supported one another. And so it was really interesting when we had our wellbeing survey that just went out over the last couple of months. One of our RAs gave us some feedback on a draft of that. We used a question that psychologists often use in wellbeing surveys, which is on mental wellbeing, to ask about, I've forgotten the exact phrasing of it, but it was something about, have you felt really down over the past month? It wasn't really down, but it was some terminology like that, really, really despondent or really low. And they said, actually, that's a really bad question to ask in this particular Pacific context. That could make a person feel very self-conscious, and we need to find different ways of asking these questions. So that was very helpful feedback to get from our RA, and we did remove that question, and we asked some other ones to do with their mental well-being. But on the whole, the questions we asked gave them an opportunity to reflect on their strengths and some of the positives. It didn't mean they couldn't tell us about how hard things had been, but I think it made a difference, Fenji, that we were trying to look at them, really respect their dignity, and realize the fact that they had kept on going was a sign of their strength, and to search that out. So that was more the tone of our interviews, rather than tell us about how awful it's been over the last 2 years. So that, I think, can make a difference how you approach it. Api, anything to add to that question?
Yeah, just one thing to add, Fenji. In the research that we did, we were also very careful to ensure that we use the right traditional protocols when entering or trying to gain access into these communities. We used pre-existing networks and connections to ease that transition into these communities, and rather than taking a hard approach, external going in, we try and use the Vonu approach. Adhere to the traditional protocols so that it's right. Our entry into the community, into the field, is right by our participants. And I think we having our RAs on the ground, it really made all that difference, because they spoke the language, they knew the people, they knew the communities, they were part, and it wasn't, they identified as one of their own, coming in to hold conversations with them. And I think that also helped in how we were received. Yeah.
So I'm aware that we're over time, but we do have one more question. I don't know if both of you just have 1 minute perhaps to respond to that, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, and thanks I realize some people are having to start going, including our colleague Maria, and yeah, we've got some lovely people who've tuned in today. Thank you very much for coming along. Just quickly for Johanna, and maybe we could, you could email us as well if you want to continue the discussion. But so you're thinking of students who have received foreign affairs funding to come, the international students in New Zealand, but they almost lose their social standing while they're in New Zealand, and then they go home to do research. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, and it might be partly to do with that. It's Lincoln, and Lincoln's a small rural town on the outskirts of Canterbury. So there's perhaps not the options for so much. It might be harder for them to find similar communities because it's a smaller area. And I probably see those who are struggling the most, because I'm seeing them as a doctor, and offering mental health support. I'm not in a supervisory or an academic role with them, but it's, I'm seeing people who have those responsible government jobs at home, or have been high achievers but are coming through young academically, who are, a little bit like a fish out of water. Like it can be a very challenging experience. So they might have great supervisors, they might be really engaged in their research and their projects. Obviously, in the last 2 years, there have been real problems with people trying to either go to another country to form research, or being stuck overseas, or having to try and do it in a different way. But I was sort of noticing some of these things beforehand, and one thing that really struck me is if you have a baby, that you have to go back to your home country to have your baby, and then you can come back. And there's just some stuff that really make things difficult. And I just wondered whether anyone's kind of looking at how this experience could be made better, because there are definitely some who kind of crawl towards the end of it and then just kind of want to go home. And you think, well, actually, if there'd been more social support, so that it was just more enjoyable as part of the fuller picture of their lives, then they and their home country, there'd just be more gains from the whole experience.
I think it probably, there's a lot going on there. I think you are in a rather privileged position as a GP with some of the conversations you have. But the other person I've spoken to at Massey who's got some interesting insights is a physio who works there, because she sees all the PhD students who've got lots of tension and issues, but I think there are some particular issues for international postgrads, and the last 2 years have been really hard with border closures, putting extra pressures on in all sorts of ways. I think we would probably have to take this discussion offline, more with down the line of some of the ways we could support them, because it's not just about the ethics of them going home to do field work, but it's about their broader experience. There have been a few studies about the best ways of providing pastoral support for international students, but I think the context of the last 2 years, and like you say, a smaller rural town and so forth, might make it really hard to connect with your own cultural group as well. But it's a really interesting issue. Happy to email some more about that.
Context, so lovely, thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Johanna.
Thanks.
Great. Well, I think we'll leave it there, but thank you all so much for joining and for your great questions, and a special thanks to Regina and Api for joining. And wish you a great night and take care. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate you joining in.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Catherine. See you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Really great session.
Yeah, feel free to email Api or me, Shane. Go for it.
You won't lose me, I don't think. Bye, guys, and thanks, Catherine, very much. Great.
Thanks. Shane, we might actually be making it over to Europe mid-year to go to a couple of conferences, and might pop over to England as part of that.
Please do. If you have some dates where you know you're going to be in London or get into London, let me introduce you to some of my higher ed and research colleagues, because they're also doing work. I'll message you of a little bit. I'm sure you're aware.
I think look, that'd be fascinating. It's such an important area. And look, basically, people have been angsting about this issue about, you know, the privilege of doing research and the right to do it and who should get to do the research, you know, for several decades now. We do need to continue to angst over it, but I don't think it means that we have to have this paralysis and put a stop to it. I think we just have to be really more reflexive about our process and have more people like Api providing some good direction.
Absolutely. Api, thanks so much for your contribution too. Be fantastic to see you. Yeah, it's a really big issue for the new director of the RGS, Joe Smith, who's a lovely man and comes from a political background. So I'm sure he'll need no second asking to welcome you and to learn from you as well. So thank you, Catherine. And I'll reach out to you today so that you've got my contact details, and hope to see you in the summer.
Lovely.
Right.
That'd be awesome.
Take care, or the winter in your case. Bye.
Bye.